Now, the start of a short-term ceasefire between Israel and Hamas militants, it's been delayed until Friday.
Well, this is according to a top Israeli official. The first truce in a near 7-week-long war reached after mediation by Qatar was hailed around the world as a sign of progress that could ease the suffering of civilians in Gaza and bring more Israeli captives back home.
But according to Israel's National Security Council director, the contacts on the release of hostages are advancing and continuing constantly. He further added that the start of the release will take place according to the original agreement between the sides, which will quote-unquote not be before Friday.
Now, Israel's National Security Council director's statement comes hours after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu held a press conference late on Wednesday. However, Netanyahu did not make a mention of a potential delay in implementation of the agreement during the press conference.
According to reports, the release of hostages along with a 4-day ceasefire was originally set to begin on Thursday morning. The breakthrough deal was agreed between Israel and Hamas to let aid into Gaza and facilitate the release of at least 50 hostages held by Hamas militants in exchange for at least 150 Palestinians jailed in Israel.
But according to the spokesperson for Israel's National Security Council, they have stressed that the delay does not indicate the deal is in peril.
Although various Gazans do not feel the same way about the deal, they have expressed mistrust in the planned truce between Israel and Hamas militants.
هدنة كذابة هذه كلها بيعملوها بعدين بكذب الشعب بخلوه يطلع واللي بقصف واللي بضرب واللي بخبط بتزبطش هيك مش حياة هذه احنا ما تعودنا على هيك اولادنا صار يجروا من غير وعي حرام عليهم حرام على اللي بصير الشيك في الشعب حرام
هدنة فاشلة هدنة كذابة قالوا لنا هدنة وهينا طلعوا الأولاد امبارح لعبوا في الشارع هانك فوتبول وكورة وانبسطوا صبحوا الصبح في شو الصبح في الليل الساعة 10 لقينا القصف وين الهدنة؟ أنا بدي إياه هدنة وقف إطلاق نار يا إما خلاص بديش هدنة كده 100.
And now, with the delay in the agreement between Israel and Hamas militants, Israel's chief military spokesperson has said that the war in Gaza will continue until the ceasefire brokered between the two sides will start.
אנחנו קיימנו היום שיח של הרמטכ"ל עם כל מפקדי החטיבות. אני גם לא יודע מתי תיכנס הפסקת אש. אנחנו נהיה ערוכים לעשות כל מה שצריך כרגע. אנחנו מתמקדים במלחמה. מה שעשינו היום זה לחשוף מנהרות של חמאס ולהשמיד אותם. זה גם מה שאנחנו הולכים לעשות בשעות הקרובות ונמשיך לעשות עד שיגיע שלב שצריך לעצור בו.
Now, for more on this, we have with us Colonel Rich Outzen, joining us live from Washington, D.C. He's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, the Jamestown Foundation, and around Middle East expert. So, welcome to World DNA.
Good to be with you.
Always a pleasure to have you, sir. Now, sir, from Thursday, the deal has now been moved to Friday. That's when the swap is expected to happen. There's no certainty on that either. Reports suggest there was a 24-hour delay as the deal was not signed. There are other issues to be ironed out as well. What's more in these negotiations, as per you?
Well, I think one of the problems is that it's not clear Hamas has total control over all the factions that have taken hostages. There have been reports that with the October 7th attacks, Hamas lost control of some of the fighters, and in fact, some criminal elements and other terroristic groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad participated in the attacks and in taking the hostages. So it's not entirely clear that they have total control of the groups who hold all of the hostages. It's also not clear, given the problems of communication among Hamas elements due to the Israeli attacks on the tunnels and on communications in Gaza Strip, that they can actually coordinate their release. It's almost certain that when the hostages were taken, they were dispersed. So I think that the principles involved with the exchange, that there will be a release of 150 Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails and 50 Israelis, it's been brokered in terms of the tempo and the duration and the conditions of the ceasefire have all been worked out. But I think probably what's happening now is Hamas is trying to be able to get control over the hostages that it is promised so that it can uphold its end of the deal.
Colonel Outson, now, yesterday when this update came out, when the news broke, everybody was definitely taking a sigh of relief that finally we are seeing a ceasefire, some kind of a pause in the fighting. But this delay, which has already come in, it underscores the fluidity of the negotiations. Is nothing certain until we actually see the hostages released?
I think that's true in the tactical sense. I mean, in terms of who gets exchanged when and sort of the dynamics of the negotiation, that's always very fluid. The Middle East is that way. However, I think one thing that's not fluid is that this military operation will come to an end. And I think Israel is dealing with increasing headwinds internationally in terms of concern over the humanitarian situation in Gaza, and frankly about whether they can achieve their military goals. Because it's one thing to say we're going to destroy Hamas and to really damage its military capabilities in the northern Gaza Strip, which they've more or less done to this point. It's another to say we're going to wipe out Hamas altogether, which was the sort of maximalistic goal at the start of the campaign. As reality sets in, both in terms of international concern and in terms of the limitations of what Israel can do on the ground, this is the Hudna, or the short-term ceasefire, is ultimately going to come to a new status quo. This war will end. That's not in doubt. The question is, in the meantime, how many lives, how many Israeli lives can they save both through rescue and through negotiation?
Right, sir. Also, let's talk about the practical implications of a pause if and when it does come into effect. Now, of course, this will give both the sides time to regroup, rearm. On the other hand, Israel has made it clear that the war will continue. Its operations on ground will not stop until they've reached their objectives here. What's your take on that?
Well, I think the military campaign from the Israeli perspective has actually moved fairly quickly. They got to the center of Gaza City and Al-Shifa Hospital, these other things that they've identified as operational goals, without an unacceptable level of casualties on their end, and a little bit quicker. Now, they've said this will go on for months and months, but I think the bigger question at this point is not the military success of the campaign. They've actually inflicted a lot of damage on the Hamas's fighting capabilities. It's on what follows, right? Because they've already said their war will be a failure. It will be a victory for Hamas if Hamas survives it. And yet something has to replace Hamas. So the question for the United States, certainly, and this is something that American diplomats and statesmen are asking their Israeli counterparts, is what happens when you've destroyed enough tunnels, or when you've been there long enough to ensure no more rocket attacks and gotten most of your hostages back? Because ultimately the Israeli army can't stay there forever. And that's the real problem here, is there's not a political horizon for how this ends, which means we'll just have more rounds of fighting. So I've been impressed from a military technical standpoint with what the Israelis have done. Their progress has been good, but there's still this gaping hole in the political horizon for how we end this in Gaza and how we ensure that it's not repeated again in 2 or 3 years.
No political horizon in the works, at least. Thank you so much for joining in, Colonel Rich Outson. Always a pleasure having you here, right here on World DNA.
Good to be with you. Thank you.